In 1975, a research team arrived in a small coastal village on a remote Japanese island expecting to find sick people. They had chosen this village specifically because its population was aging faster than almost anywhere else in the country. By every actuarial model, it should have been a community overwhelmed by chronic disease, cardiovascular failure, metabolic collapse, the full spectrum of conditions that accompany extreme old age. What they found instead paralyzed them. Not a single case of type 2 diabetes, not one. In a village of over 3,000 people, where a significant portion of the population was over 80, where 15 residents were over 100 years old, the researchers could not find a single diabetic. They checked their methodology, they rechecked their data, they expanded the study, they kept finding the same thing. What made this genuinely disturbing, not reassuring, disturbing, was what happened next. When the children and grandchildren of these disease-free centenarians left the village and adopted a westernized diet in the decades following World War II, something happened within a single generation that the researchers described as one of the most dramatic metabolic collapses ever documented in a stable population. Type 2 diabetes exploded. Obesity surged, cardiovascular deaths climbed. Same genetic pool, same island, same water supply. The only variable that changed was how they ate. The research team eventually identified 3 specific components of the traditional meal pattern that, when analyzed at the molecular level, produce measurable changes in the precise biological mechanisms that cause and reverse type 2 diabetes. Those mechanisms have since been published in peer-reviewed journals. The findings are sitting in medical databases that anyone can access tonight. And yet most people with diabetes, most people managing blood sugar, most physicians treating metabolic disease have never had a single conversation about any of them. Today at the Eternal Vigor Way, I'm a health researcher. I have no pharmaceutical sponsors, I have no supplement products, and I have something most health content doesn't: the time to explain the actual mechanism, not just the headline. Stay through all 3 components, because the third one, the one that looks the most like a behavioral suggestion, contains the most important molecular biology in this entire video, and it is the part most people implement incorrectly. Before the 3 components, the most common objection needs to be addressed directly. Maybe this population simply has favorable genetics. Researchers asked the same question. The answer came in a form that no one expected. When younger generations from this same village, carrying the identical genetic inheritance of their centenarian grandparents, abandoned the traditional meal pattern and adopted processed Western foods, their rates of obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease surpassed the Japanese national average within 30 years. Researchers from Okinawa International University, who studied this demographic shift, estimated that approximately 2/3 of the longevity advantage observed in the traditional population was attributable to diet and lifestyle rather than genetics. The genetic contribution, real but modest, primarily manifested only in those attempting to survive past 100. For everyone else, the meal pattern was doing the work. This finding reframes the entire question. The disease-free status of this population was not inherited. It was constructed, meal by meal, day by day, across generations, through 3 specific dietary practices whose mechanisms modern molecular biology has now made fully legible. The traditional diet of this village was built on a foundation that differs sharply from mainland Japanese cuisine in one specific way. The primary calorie source was not white rice. It was sweet potato, specifically purple and orange varieties that the villagers called by local names and consumed as 60 to 70% of their total caloric intake across generations. This distinction matters more than it initially appears. White rice carries a glycemic index of approximately 73 to 89 depending on variety and preparation. Every bowl triggers a rapid glucose release into the bloodstream, a sharp insulin response from the pancreas, and, repeated across decades, a progressive degradation of insulin receptor sensitivity. This is the slow, silent mechanism through which type 2 diabetes develops in most people who eat a rice-dominant diet over a lifetime. Sweet potatoes carry a glycemic index of approximately 54. Purple varieties test as low as the mid-40s. That 25 to 40 point difference in glycemic index, compounded across 3 meals a day for 40 or 50 years, represents an enormous reduction in cumulative pancreatic stress. But the glycemic index difference is only the first layer of the mechanism. Purple sweet potatoes contain a class of compounds called anthocyanins, the pigments responsible for the deep purple coloration of the flesh. A 2024 study published in a peer-reviewed journal under Cell Press demonstrated that purple sweet potato anthocyanins did not merely lower blood sugar in diabetic models, they normalized it, bringing fasting blood glucose from diabetic levels to near normal ranges within 10 days by specifically restoring gut bacteria populations that had been depleted by a high-fat diet. Separately, researchers studying healthy adults who consumed an anthocyanin-rich extract from purple potato alongside a standard meal found significant reductions in both post-meal blood glucose and insulin. The blood sugar and pancreatic response did not spike the way they normally would after eating. The mechanism: anthocyanins inhibit 2 specific digestive enzymes, alpha amylase and alpha glucosidase, that are responsible for breaking starch into glucose in the small intestine. Slow those enzymes and glucose enters the bloodstream gradually rather than in a surge. The pancreas responds proportionally. The receptor does not become chronically overloaded. This village consumed this compound daily for 4 centuries without knowing the name of the enzyme it was inhibiting. The practical translation: wherever possible, replace 1 white rice or white bread portion per day with sweet potato, boiled or steamed rather than baked, which has a lower glycemic response. And for maximum benefit, cook the sweet potato the day before and refrigerate it overnight. The cooling process creates resistant starch, a form that passes through the small intestine undigested, feeds beneficial gut bacteria, and produces no blood sugar spike at all. Same food, dramatically different metabolic outcome. The traditional meal plate of this population looked nothing like contemporary Western nutrition recommendations. It was approximately 85% plant-based carbohydrate, primarily the sweet potato, 9% protein, and 6% fat. By modern standards, the protein content appears almost deficient, but the source and form of that protein was doing something specific that quantity alone cannot replicate. Protein came almost entirely from 2 sources: fish and soy, tofu, miso soup, edamame, fermented soy preparations, and small portions of locally sourced fish. Red meat was consumed rarely, primarily during communal celebrations, rather than as a daily dietary component. The soy component has been studied extensively in the context of diabetes risk. A large Japanese prospective study that followed over 21,000 healthy adults for years found that women who consumed tofu nearly daily had a 33% lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes compared to women who ate it fewer than 3 times per week. A 33% risk reduction from a single whole food consumed consistently. The biological mechanism involves compounds in soy called isoflavones, specifically genistein and didzine. These compounds improve insulin receptor sensitivity. In simple terms, in type 2 diabetes, insulin cannot effectively deliver its message to cells because the receptor, the molecular lock that insulin fits, has become functionally impaired. Soy isoflavones improve the receptor's responsiveness, making the existing insulin in the system more effective. This is the same therapeutic goal pursued by several classes of diabetes medication. The difference is that fermented soy foods have been part of this population's diet for centuries, and they cost a fraction of $1 per serving. One practical note for anyone on thyroid medication: soy can interfere with thyroid hormone absorption if consumed simultaneously. The solution is straightforward. Simply separate soy consumption from thyroid medication by 2 to 3 hours. The benefit is preserved, the interaction is avoided. Before component 3, which is where the molecular mechanism becomes most important and most misunderstood, I want to pause. What you have just heard is peer-reviewed science that has been sitting in public medical databases for years. It is not alternative medicine. It is not fringe research. It is documented, replicable, published evidence about a population that achieved something modern, pharmaceutical intervention has never replicated: the complete absence of type 2 diabetes across an entire community, sustained across generations. That is exactly the kind of evidence the Eternal Vigor Way exists to translate, research that your appointment doesn't have time to cover, explained in a way that you can actually use. If you are not subscribed, do that right now. Because what comes next, the third component and the molecular switch at the center of everything, is the piece that determines whether the first two actually work inside your body. Subscribe, then stay with me. The third component of this traditional meal pattern appears, on the surface, to be a behavioral practice. It is actually a precise molecular intervention. The practice is called Hara Hachi, a teaching that roughly translates as: eat until you are 80% full, stop before satiety, leave the table while you could still eat more, every meal, every day. When researchers quantified what this practice produces physiologically, they found that traditional adherents consumed approximately 10 to 15% fewer calories than standard nutritional guidelines recommend. Not dramatic caloric restriction, not deprivation, a consistent, moderate daily gap. And that gap, those specific conditions of mild cellular energy deficit, activates a protein enzyme that most people with diabetes have never heard of, despite the fact that it sits at the center of every major pathway relevant to their condition. The enzyme is called AMPK, adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase. Its function is to act as the cell's energy sensor. When cellular energy is abundant, after a full meal, when glucose is flooding in, AMPK is quiet. It yields to another pathway called mTOR, whose primary function is growth, storage, and cellular construction. mTOR is not inherently harmful. It is necessary. But in a person eating 3 full meals plus frequent snacks, keeping cells in a continuous state of energy surplus, mTOR is active almost without interruption. And chronically overactive mTOR does 3 things that directly cause and perpetuate type 2 diabetes. First, it progressively reduces insulin receptor sensitivity, the same lock and key mechanism that soy isoflavones are working to restore. Second, it promotes visceral fat accumulation, fat deposited around the organs, which produces inflammatory compounds that worsen insulin resistance systemically. Third, it suppresses autophagy, the cellular cleanup process that removes damaged proteins and dysfunctional cellular components. When autophagy is chronically suppressed, metabolic dysfunction accumulates at the cellular level faster than the body can repair it. A study published in the journal Diabetes demonstrated that AMPK activation is the critical mediator of how caloric restriction improves insulin sensitivity in skeletal muscle. When researchers eliminated the AMPK gene in study models, caloric restriction stopped working entirely. the blood sugar benefits disappeared. Without AMPK, the mechanism has no engine. When this population ate to 80% fullness consistently, creating a 10 to 15% daily energy gap, their cells spent meaningful time in mild energy deficit. AMPK activated, mTOR was suppressed, insulin receptor sensitivity improved, fat oxidation increased, autophagy cleared cellular debris, chronic inflammation declined. Now connect all three components simultaneously. Sweet potatoes with a low glycemic index prevent the blood sugar surges that chronically activate mTOR in the first place. Soy isoflavones directly restore the insulin receptor sensitivity that mTOR suppression had been degrading, and Hara Hachi creates the daily energy gap that activates AMPK and shifts the cellular environment from storage mode into restoration mode. These three components are not independent strategies. They are a system, each one addressing a different node of the same metabolic failure, each one amplifying the effectiveness of the others. Most people watching this do not live in a remote Japanese village. The specific purple sweet potato varieties consumed traditionally may not be available at every grocery store, and adopting an entirely new meal culture is not a realistic goal for anyone with an existing life. The practical adaptation requires 3 shifts, not a complete dietary overhaul. The first shift, replace 1 starch per day with sweet potato, not every meal. 1. If you are eating white rice at dinner, substitute a steamed or boiled sweet potato. Orange varieties are widely available. Purple varieties, when accessible, provide the additional anthocyanin benefit. Cook it the day before, refrigerate overnight, reheat before eating. The resistant starch formation further reduces the glycemic impact. The second shift, add 1 daily soy source, not soy protein isolate, not processed soy products with extended ingredient lists. Whole soy foods, tofu, miso soup, or edamame, whichever is most accessible and most enjoyable. The JACC study found the strongest protective effect with daily tofu consumption, but any whole soy food provides the isoflavones that improve insulin receptor function. The third shift, implement the 80% rule at 1 meal per day. Begin with dinner, where the habit is most controllable. Eat more slowly. The brain requires approximately 20 minutes to register satiety signals from the stomach. Use a smaller plate. After finishing what feels like enough, wait 10 minutes before deciding whether to eat more. In most cases, the hunger resolves before the 10 minutes elapse. One important caution, do not attempt all 3 shifts simultaneously in the first week. Implement 1 per week, allowing each to become habitual before adding the next. Research on dietary behavior change consistently shows that layered, gradual implementation produces sustained outcomes. Rapid total overhaul produces temporary enthusiasm followed by reversion. And give the process time. The AMPK activation, the insulin receptor restoration, the inflammatory reduction, these are cumulative processes. Meaningful change in HbA1c, the 3-month average blood sugar marker, requires approximately 90 days of consistent adherence to observe. The cells do not restore in a week. They were not damaged in a week. There is a carved stone marker in the village at the center of this research. The inscription, translated roughly, reads, "At 80, you are merely a youth. At 90, if your ancestors invite you into heaven, ask them to wait until you are 100. Then you might consider it." That is not a decorative sentiment. It is the sincere expectation of a population that for 4 centuries did not develop the disease that currently affects over 37 million Americans and hundreds of millions of people worldwide. The mechanism is now understood. The 3 components are documented in peer-reviewed literature. The molecular pathways, AMPK, mTOR, alpha-glucosidase inhibition, soy isoflavone-mediated receptor sensitization are not speculative. They are published biology. What this population knew intuitively, modern molecular science has since confirmed from the other direction. And the gap between that confirmation and your dinner plate is not a scientific problem, it is an information problem. If what you heard in this video shifted something, if it gave you a framework for understanding your blood sugar that no appointment has ever provided, then you already understand what the Eternal Vigor Way is here to do. Every week, this channel translates current research on aging, metabolic health, and longevity into evidence that adults over 60 can actually use, not supplement recommendations, not fear-based dietary rules, published science, explained honestly, without a financial agenda. Subscribe before you close this video, because next week we are covering the 5 foods that research identifies as the most damaging to insulin sensitivity in adults over 60, including 2 that appear in nearly every healthy eating list, and that most people consume daily without knowing what they are doing to their pancreatic function. This is the Eternal Vigor Way. The information here does not replace your physician's guidance, but it gives you the questions that make every medical conversation more productive. The village existed, the data is real, and what kept those people disease-free for 4 centuries is available to you, starting at your next meal.